Welcome to another episode of The Brand Called You, a podcast and podcast show that brings you leadership lessons, knowledge, experience, and wisdom from thousands of successful individuals from around the world. I'm your host, Ashutosh Garg, and today I'm delighted to welcome a well recognized expert from the world of public affairs and communications from New Jersey, USA, Mr. Elie Jacobs. Elie, welcome to the show.
It's Elie, but close.
Elie, sorry, my apologies. Elie
Not a
Jacobs.
problem.
Elie is the founding partner of Purposeful Advisors. He began his communications career as a press aide in the post presidential office of President Bill Clinton. So, Elie, my first question: what inspired you to pursue a career in public affairs and communications, and how has this purpose evolved over time?
I wouldn't say anything really inspired me. It was more just dumb luck.
Okay.
When I finished college, I didn't really have an idea of what I wanted to do.
Mhm.
9/11 took place, unfortunately, and I packed a bag and went traveling. Bag of clothes, bag of GMAT books, LSAT books, GRE books, really having no idea what I wanted to do. And at some point, several weeks later, my parents insisted I come back to the States. And I was reading the New Yorker, the magazine, The New Yorker, and the front section is the Talk of the Town section, which is often written kind of tongue in cheek, little sarcastic. But they had written an article about how President Clinton's office in Harlem, recently opened office in Harlem, was looking for interns.
Mm.
Think about the time period. It's the early 2000s. He had left office a little less than a year earlier.
Yeah.
Interns, ha ha ha. But they reprinted the ad that the office had put out to the Columbia Political Science
Mm.
Department. And I just responded to the ad.
Wow.
Basically out of not having any idea of what I wanted to do and it seeming like something kind of interesting and not really having any expectation of it leading to anything, but just sent a resume in, and next thing I knew, I was there, for several months that were pretty formative in
Mm.
a small situation. This was well before the global initiative had started. I started exactly a year to the day from when he left office,
Wow.
and within a few weeks, the deputy press secretary had left, and I kind of became functionally the deputy press secretary without having any idea of really what I was doing or any training to what to do it.
Mm.
Realized I had some talent for it. I had a great mentor in the office at the time, and when it was my time to leave the office, I asked her for help in kind of networking the Clinton exile to go do a lot of informational interviews and just kind of try to understand how the industry works, what area in the industry I would want to be in. So I did that and met some terrific people and kind of got some clarity on where I would want to be, where I didn't want to be.
Mm.
It took a little bit of time until I finally figured that all out. Probably took another 6 years with a couple of good firms and between the two time periods. But wouldn't say anything really inspired me. It was once I kind of just landed into it, I realized I enjoyed it and I wanted to do more of it.
Amazing. And for my viewers and listeners, can you share a pivotal moment from your early days as a press aide to President Clinton that shaped your approach to strategic communication?
I don't know if there's one specific incident. I think it was the knowledge that was really implanted on you that every time you picked up the phone, every time you walked as part of the entourage, every event you went to as part of his entourage, you weren't representing yourself, you were representing him.
Hmm.
And I think that idea that as an advisor or as an aide or an intern, whatever that is, regardless of the size of the company or the high net worth individual or the important individual that you're working for, whoever your client is, it's about the client. It's not about you.
Hmm. Amazing. So let's talk about public affairs and strategic communications now. How do you define purposeful advising, and why is this critical for long-term organizational success?
So it's interesting when we called ourselves purposeful advisors, myself and my fellow founding partner Frank DiMaria. Um, when we talk about purpose, it's not necessarily the same way that most people talk about purpose. Most people talk about purpose in the sense of ESG or DEI or planting trees
Yeah.
or cleaning water, all of which are fantastic things and things that responsible companies should look for opportunities to do. We're not the right people to advise you on how to do that.
Hmm.
Where we talk about purpose, we're really talking about helping companies either understand what their base purpose is or help companies rediscover what their base purpose is. We
Hmm.
have this fundamental belief that in kind of this rapidly changing media environment, geopolitical environment, the companies that really stick to their original purpose and understand what that is and recognize that that needs to flow through everything that you do from functionally what you do to tactically to communications wise
Hmm.
that you need to do, those are the companies that are going to be resilient.
Mm.
So we when we get involved with a company, we dig through all kinds of layers, whether it's a startup and we're helping them really try to understand how to talk about what their purpose is, because it's
Hmm.
not about making money.
Yeah.
That's a benefit. That's not the purpose.
Mm.
So that's what we spend a lot of time doing. So when we talk about purposeful advising, that's what we're talking about. We're not talking
Amazing.
necessarily about the kind of important things companies should be doing. We're talking
Mm.
about helping companies really get to their bottom purpose.
Fascinating. Fascinating. And based on all the experience you've done with so many different clients, what, in your view, are some of the common mistakes organizations make when they're trying to shape their narrative?
The first and foremost one is not being honest.
Mm.
That doesn't mean necessarily lying, but
Correct.
it does potentially meaning making it more aspirational than real.
Hmm.
The obvious examples are Thronos and WeWork and dozens of other companies that
Yeah.
were unicorns and then crashed because there was just no there there.
Hmm.
That's the biggest one. I think it's really having an honest look of what you are setting out to accomplish, what you have accomplished, what you
Hmm.
seek to accomplish, what the possibility of doing that in what time period. And it doesn't mean that that doesn't change over time. Obviously, is when you're startup to Series A to IPO to multinational company, there are different phases through all of that.
Hmm.
But you have to be honest, and I think that's a role that advisors play a big role in. It's kind of being that objective referee,
Hmm.
and kind of to be cheeky about it, calling BS when it needs to be called to ensure that a company is not getting ahead of itself. Because the last thing that you want is for a company to be out there talking about we talk about things that brand is what you say you do, reputation is what everybody else says you do. And
Hmm.
the delta between those things, we call that your risk aperture. Because the greater the spread between what you say you do and what people's expectations are,
Hmm.
that means that there's more opportunity for things to go wrong, for people to put the wrong idea of what you do into what you do,
Hmm.
or have expectations that are outsized of what you're actually capable of doing.
Right.
So we want companies to talk about their brand in line with what their reputation is and ensure that their reputation is built and maintained and is created to be resilient along with what
Hmm.
their brand is going to be.
Hmm. Well said. And Ellie, what makes an organization's story compelling enough to break through the noise in today's media environment?
Honestly, given the news of the week, I don't know that anything can break through.
Yes.
There are obviously the unicorns not in the billion-dollar company, although that's part of it, but kind of like those, tremendous innovations, chat GPTs
Mm.
of the world, and they're going to break through kind of just because they're such a big deal.
Yeah.
Usually, more often than not, companies are paid attention to when something goes wrong,
Mm.
whether it's a large-scale crisis or just a
Correct.
company that misses earnings or malfeasance by a CEO. I mean, for instance, today is April 22nd. Tesla's reporting earnings today. They're down, I don't know, almost a quarter since the beginning of the year.
Hmm.
There are various different metrics people have come up with. I don't know that I really believe any of it, but you can kind of, when you see something, you know that it's true. Elon Musk's position within the administration and things that he's done, things that he's said, has obviously dragged the stock down. Like his reputation has played a role into their overall stock.
Mm.
Tesla is going to get a lot of press today because of Elon Musk and the
Yeah.
negative impact that he has had on that company.
Mm.
I think for a company to really break through, you have to have a good story.
Mm.
And a good story has a beginning, middle, and end. And it has the difference between opportunities and challenges, fears and hopes. There's a villain usually, there's a hero, there's a resolution, kind of classic
Yeah.
storytelling. If you have a company
Mm.
that can kind of fit into that classic narrative, as my old boss and mentor, Mark McKinnon, has put it, when you have that narrative structure, people are like moths to a flame for that. It
Mm.
just speaks inherently into the way people think.
Mm.
So when you're putting together your brand narrative or your
Mm.
brand architecture, have that in mind. Think about like, how are we going to talk about this in kind of that Joseph Campbellic way of we are the hero towards something.
Mm. Amazing. When I was much younger, and I'm much older than you, but I remember in the old days when all the digital media wasn't there, one of the principles of releasing poor results, it was always said release poor results or bad news on a Friday evening and release all the good news on a Monday morning. I wanted to ask you, what is the role of transparency in crisis communications? And is there anything called too much transparency?
there is a possibility of too much transparency.
Hmm.
In general, when it comes to crisis communications, there's kind of two schools of thought. There's get everything out at once, regardless of what you know, what's in that. You're just getting all the
Yeah.
information out, kind of overwhelm the system and let them suss it out while you work on it inside.
Hmm.
And then there's kind of the more pragmatic approach where it's let's understand what went wrong. Well, first, let's stop whatever is happening from
Yeah.
happening. If a chemical company has poisoned water or there's a drug that's out there that is hurting children, or whatever, like first stop the problem.
Hmm.
Second, identify who the victims are. Third, figure out what the victims need to be better.
Hmm.
And fourth, start understanding what went wrong that led to that position. And then fifth,
Hmm.
ensure that those things can't happen again.
Hmm.
So when it comes to transparency, the way I approach it is transparency is important when you are demonstrating how you are taking care of the victims
Hmm.
and the steps that you're putting in place to ensure that nothing ever happens again.
Hmm.
Transparency around the rest, that's situation specific, but in general, people don't really need to know how the sausage was made.
Correct. 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 So a few minutes back, you spoke a little bit about ChatGPT. How do you see generative AI and other emerging technologies changing the landscape of strategic communication?
Tremendously.
Uh-huh.
It's overwhelming. The speed and the size and the scope of how AI is changing things.
Hmm.
The first time I tried ChatGPT a year ago, year and a half ago, whatever it was, and I was literally sat in this chair for an hour stunned. And I'm one of these people who is very, very reticent about AI.
Hmm.
I'm kind of the Eric Schmidt group of we need to be careful and deliberate.
Hmm.
Smart people need to put regulation in place, and at some point, there needs to be a human somewhere who has the capability of unplugging the whole thing.
Hmm.
I'm not kind of this halcyon, everything's going to be great. Let's just, let it go.
Yeah.
But in communications, just from the fact that Frank and I can run a pretty effective agency,
Hmm.
leveraging two different models. I use Claude, he uses ChatGPT. We both play around with Perplexity a little bit and a few others. We don't really need junior staff.
Hmm.
But that's also because between the two of us, we have some 6 decades of experience. So we
Correct.
know the right prompts. We know the things that we're looking for.
Correct.
So I think, what I see as one of the big threats to the industry, I see two streams of threats. There's the personnel threat, where how are you going to get junior employees that those years of experience to use a large language model effectively? And then the secondary part of it is we have been focused for the last 20 years, 20 plus years on search engine optimization and keyword development, all these sorts of different things so that you
Hmm.
come up higher in the Google rankings or you get pushed down further in the Google rankings,
Hmm.
all based on the idea that somebody's going to go to Google first to look for you. I don't
Hmm.
think that's going to be the case very much longer. I think that's already changing, that these bots are going to be, and as they become more agentic, it's going to become even more direct, that you're going to be getting an answer as opposed to options.
Right.
And I think that's something that as a society we need to be worried about. But in particular, as communicators, we need to be worried about, because we need to really understand
Hmm.
what's going into these models to give that result, so that we can try to influence what's going in, because we can't
Hmm.
result what's coming out
Correct.
necessarily.
Correct.
So I think that those, it's a little bit of a scary world, but it's exciting. And obviously there's humongous challenges around misinformation and disinformation and
Hmm.
malinformation.
Hmm.
And AI only exacerbates all of that.
Correct.
My hope is that there will be some responsible actors involved, and hopefully some global guidance. But at this point, I don't see that that's happening.
Yeah. 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 Well said. But the other question I wanted to get your thoughts on was that how do geopolitical factors impact strategic corporate communication? Because from a world which was becoming borderless, now the borders seem to be going up in every country. How should companies adapt to such geopolitics?
So I think 20 years ago, earlier in my career, there were public relations professionals who probably didn't know how to spell geopolitics,
Mm.
and they were very, very good at their jobs.
Yeah.
There were others, like the firm I worked at, Brunswick, and other subsequent firms that I've worked at, where it was at the forefront of our brains at all times. We were working
Mm,
on international companies, international mergers. You had to deal with cross-border issues when it
mm,
came to trade, when it came to employees, when it came to other stakeholders. So geopolitics has always played a large role. I think now it's just so in your face that
mm,
companies that are ignoring it, or companies that weren't plotting things out. I mean, any company that was caught by surprise that tariffs were introduced by this president
mm,
hasn't been doing their homework.
mm.
There was no doubt there were going to be tariffs. Now, there's a question of how severe it was going to be, what it was going
Yeah.
to look like. That's all that could all be up for grabs. But there was
Mm,
no question he was going to attempt to put
mm.
tariffs in place.
Yeah.
I think where you really need to do some very advanced modeling,
Mm,
and kind of almost soothsaying, is trying to understand the repercussions, right? So, okay, now you understand that Donald Trump has been elected. Chances are there's going to be a tariff regime put in place sometime in the next
mm,
18 months. Full stop.
mm.
Now you have to start modeling and really trying to understand different companies, how different countries are going to react, and start putting it all on a piece of paper, on a
Yeah.
board, basically, to understand the tertiary impacts of that,
Correct.
and try to plan around it. I mean, the problem
Mm,
is when you come up with all these different possibilities, you
mm,
get almost scored. It's almost the paralysis by analysis, which you can't do if you're a functioning
mm,
company and you have
mm.
shareholders and you have employees and you have everything else. So I think, geopolitics has never been more important. I think where a lot of advisories come short is that they don't have the capabilities either in-house or the capabilities of reaching the right people to give them the
Mm,
kind of guidance that they need for their clients.
mm,
And I think part of what makes a good communications advisor today,
mm.
is more than anything else is knowing some of the right questions to ask,
Right.
and being skeptical.
Correct.
And often, we are often the jerks in the room,
Mm,
who are pushing CEOs and executives
mm,
well past their comfort point by questioning basic assumptions.
mm,
And I think that that's our role, though. We have to be the truth tellers.
mm. Amazing. My next question is how can strategic communication professionals better anticipate and prepare for reputational threats in the age of viral social media?
It's hard. There's one idea: you just don't put your head up ever. If you are in a consumer company, nobody should never ever know who you are. Nobody should know
Mm,
who your executives are. If you are a consumer company, to be very careful about what the image, the image or the brand that you're putting out there versus what
mm,
your reputation is.
mm.
A few years ago, Nike came out very strongly in favor of Colin Kaepernick, an American
Yeah.
football player who had
Mm,
taken a knee during the national anthem to protest police violence against African Americans. Um, Several other things. He ended up not continuing with the 49ers and all kinds of other things. Nike came out very in favor of him. But Nike has looked at it as their role in society is sort of playing that role of, they talk about Charles Barkley, the old basketball
mm,
player. You'd say, I'm not a role model, but
mm,
they made a commercial out of that, right? So Nike going out and doing something like that is expected.
mm.
If Colgate Palmolive came out with the same thing, that would
Yeah.
be really problematic. People would
Mm,
look at that very skeptically and likely
mm,
make fun of it and
mm.
likely drag the company down. So I think
Yeah.
companies, going back to, the idea of purpose, companies need to understand what that is and how it plays out in multi-factor different ways.
Amazing. My next question, Ellie, is what are some ethical considerations that communications advisors or professionals need to keep in mind when shaping their own narratives?
You can't lie
Hmm.
ever. There are clients that will push you to the brink of that. They will tell you, we can do X, Y, and Z, and then you'll go out and take that to the press, only to find out that that's not true. There's a great scene in Bethany McLean's terrific book about the fall of Enron, the smartest guys in the room,
Mm,
where Mark Palmer, former colleague of mine, wonderful guy, was the communications person at Enron, and he had just gotten off the phone with her, and she had discovered the accounting malfeasance,
mm,
going through everything.
mm,
And then he went to the CFO to ask questions about it, and he could tell by the CFO's response that the
mm,
CFO was lying to him. And the way Bethany recounts it in the book is Mark ran to
mm,
the bathroom to throw up. I think, again, if we're the truth tellers, we also have to be kind of the arbiter of ethics. We have to make sure that nobody's doing or saying anything that is off board. And
Hmm.
more importantly, at least for me personally, I know that there are plenty of communications advisors that will work for people that are not necessarily terrific. They will work to rehab the image and the reputation of people that don't necessarily deserve it.
Hmm.
I'd like to think we keep a relatively high level of ethics of who we'll work with
Yeah.
and why we'll work with them.
Hmm.
But at the same time, the way, at least in the US, that everybody deserves defense and in the court of law,
Yeah.
I do believe that everybody deserves the opportunity to defend their reputation.
Hmm. Amazing. Uh, what role do advisors like yourselves play in managing any tensions or stresses between different stakeholder groups within an organization? And this is happening. Shareholder activism is also becoming very, very big now all over the world.
Yeah, yeah. So, I mean, shareholders are just one segment of the
Absolutely.
stakeholder
Yeah.
panoply.
Yeah.
Obviously, when you're talking about employees, the communities that employees live
Yeah.
in, regulators, legislators, and spreading that across various different geographies.
Mm.
When we, so I came up with an acronym for RISK, reputational intelligence, stakeholder knowledge.
Wow.
So we
Okay.
think that
Mm.
knowing your stakeholders, not just knowing who they are, but knowing what they think,
Mm.
really understanding what their sentiments are, even if it's just general,
Mm.
is vital. Because if you don't have that, you're going to be caught by surprise. And when you're caught by surprise, that's when mistakes really, really happen.
Mm.
So, in terms of kind of the role that strategic communicators play with stakeholder management,
Mm.
we're at the forefront of that. We have to be,
Mm.
because the stakeholders are the ones we're talking to.
Mm.
I don't necessarily care if my client is in the Wall Street Journal. We got a
Mm.
profile in the Wall Street Journal.
Yeah.
Is that great? It could be, but are the stakeholders that I care about reading the Wall Street Journal?
Mm.
Maybe the stakeholders I care about are reading the Cleveland Plains Dealer
Mm.
or the Times of London,
Yeah.
right? So it's very much you need to gear not only what you're saying, but how you're saying it and through what mediums you're saying it to
Mm.
ensure that your stakeholders are not just getting the message, but getting the message the way you want them to.
Mm. Well said. Two more questions for you, Ellie. Tell me about a case, and obviously I don't want any names, where your approach to communication significantly changed the outcome.
Significantly changed. Um, I would there was a client we were working with that was going through a pharmaceutical recall situation.
Mhm.
Um, it was a heart pill, and they on their own had discovered that, and this is all public. I won't use the company's
Yeah.
name, but this information is all
Yeah.
public, and this
Yeah.
is well over a decade ago. They had discovered several misshaped pills as they were coming through the line. Out of millions and millions of pills that they were making, they found a couple pills that were too big. So they stopped the line. They checked all the pills that they had in the warehouse, a billion pills, something like that. They found three more. So that triggered a recall with the FDA, which
Mm.
then triggers plaintiff lawsuits and all kinds of other fun things.
Mhm.
But going back to sort of where I find our role is kind of being that jerk in the room of asking questions that people may not be asking or are afraid to ask because they might look
Mm.
stupid, or
Mm.
afraid to ask because it's going to offend somebody. Once I started asking questions about the process from manufacturing to a person's medicine cabinet,
Mm.
the packaging, everything like that, it turns out that this pill comes in not in a bottle, it comes in a blister pack that
Mhm.
you have to, push through. So I said, aren't blister packs size limited? Meaning only a certain pill can fit in. They said,
Yeah.
yeah. And I said, but if the pill was too big, it wouldn't have fit in the blister pack. So you
Mhm.
wouldn't have been able to send it out to
Yeah.
anybody. Like no one would have, it would be very unlikely that a patient actually got
Mm.
a pill that was too large, and too large is problematic, right? It either means there's too much medication or
Correct.
there's too much coding, which means you're not going to get the medication
Yeah.
quickly enough. It's a big
Mm.
problem.
Mm.
So I think, in that case, it was kind of that ask questions first, ask all the questions. Don't be
Correct.
ashamed about asking questions.
Yeah.
Because if we're not asking the questions, somebody else likely will at some point down the line.
Mm. Amazing. And my last question for you. What is one piece of advice you would give to your own younger self about navigating the complex world of public affairs?
Get more sleep.
Absolutely.
I would think, we spend a lot of time doing something called red teaming.
Mm.
Basically, it's devil's advocate. It's trying to think like your competition.
Mm.
But that's always done in the guise of, it's always sort of even subconsciously done under the guise of you're trying to accomplish something.
Hmm.
I think if there was an ability to have told a younger self to like really focus on the ability to think like the enemy
Hmm.
completely,
Hmm.
subjectively like the enemy, not
Yeah.
objectively like the enemy,
Hmm.
that I think I've had a pretty good career. I think that could have been a touchstone on top.
Hmm. Well said. And on that note, Elie, I just want to say thank you so much for speaking to me about your own amazing journey. I just love the way you so uh, easily said you became an intern with President Clinton and how that seemed to have changed a lot of your life. Thank you for talking about public affairs and strategic communication at such length. We covered some very interesting ground on purposeful advising, some of the mistakes organizations make, about the importance of proper storytelling, about the importance of transparency. And what you said a couple of times was that don't lie, tell the truth. That is an important factor. We also covered some interesting talk ground on technology, generative AI, on geopolitics and the impact, which seems to be changing the whole world. We also spoke a little bit about ethics. Thank you for speaking to me and good luck to you.
My pleasure. Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you. Thank you for listening to the Brand Called You videocast and podcast, a platform that brings you knowledge, experience, and wisdom of hundreds of successful individuals from around the world. Do visit our website www.tbcy.in to watch and listen to the stories of many more individuals. You can also follow us on YouTube, Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. Just search for the Brand Called You.